Hi, hello, and welcome to this rather exquisite episode of Geography Girl. Today we're talking about a recipe book that inspired the hearts and minds of citizens across the Soviet Union. The Soviet bloc battled with food shortage and famine throughout its lifetime, and much of the population struggled to put food on the table. But yet, the book of healthy and tasty food sat proudly on the shelves and coffee tables in housings across the land. Brimming with decadent recipes of caviar, crab, and the like, and boasting the abundance of food availability, the culinary culture, and thus the success of the communist regime, and ended up transforming Russian cuisine. The book was one of the most important tools for introducing the Soviet utopia in everyday life. The writings of a Soviet lecturer says, "The book is by no means an ordinary book. It is a memorial of the Soviet era, in a sense, the gastronomic equivalent to the Moscow Metro. There were a dozen editions with 8 million copies, inspiring and guiding generations of those who can cook at home, who is practically everyone in the country." Translated to Kniga, meaning book, the Book of Healthy and Tasty Food was one of the only cookbooks to exist in the Soviet Union. Russian food before the Soviet Union was very different and had a lot of variety, and in Tsarist Russia there was a polarity of extreme poverty and extreme opulence. The vast majority were living on the edge, eating a basic Gwyneth Paltrow-like diet of fermented food, cabbages, foraged berries. On the other hand of the spectrum, the aristocracy were living at large, eating caviar and lots of meat. Most Russians lived off the land or didn't eat at all. It was a pervasive issue in Russia, living on a diet of grains and sugars, and there were issues of food prices and shortages. Now 1917 brings with it Bolshevik revolution in Russia. A new USSR united 1/6 of the world's land mass, spanning 12 time zones and 100 ethnicities. Ties to the aristocracy needed to be broken, with new foods needed to define the new empire. The Bolsheviks looked to feed everyone and break away from the decadence of the Tsarist era, and to relieve the working classes from foraging. Seeking to liberate their population from the need to cook their own food and to free women from the quote-unquote kitchen slavery and free them to go work alongside men in the factories and on farms, it was felt that it was the government's responsibility to feed the population. And so, under Lenin, there were state-run cafeterias. This was hoped to be an effective way to consolidate the nation's food system. The 1920s in Russia were characterized by a feeling of universal brotherhood, and labor communes really took off. Apartments became homes for multiple families, and the old restaurants of Tsarist regimes and bars became these communal canteens. However, the Soviet Union still fell foul to massive food shortages. There was a death of 5 million people between 1918 and 21 due to numerous conflicts, the persecution of the peasant class, and the government collectivization of grain farms. This was seemingly forgotten and forgiven in the eyes of the editors of the book in the 1939 edition, as they recalled it. "The Bolshevik rate of developing the Soviet food industry brings us closer to a time when socialism will demonstrate to the world an example of unprecedented abundance of food. An abundance of highly nutritious, varied and tasty food, the best in the world. An abundance which will completely solve nutritional problems and create all the facilities for the education of a healthy, strong and eternally youthful people." There was actually a contemporary renewed interest in these canteens in Russia. A recent poll shows that half of young Russians believes that the fall of these canteens was a bad thing. In Moscow, Stolovaya 57 is a popular hang, serving boiled veggies, jellied pork, chicken Kiev, and stuffed cabbage. With Lenin's death, Stalin took the lead in the 1920s and brought with him forced collectivization. The countryside starved to feed the cities. Armed police would raid peasants' houses, and 5 million died across the Ukraine and Kazakhstan, with corpses piling in the roads. Where Lenin and the Bolsheviks had promised basics like land, peace and bread, there was an ideological shift that came with the Stalinist era that looked beyond the basics towards a more bourgeois lifestyle, believing that people needed more than survival to give them faith in the Soviet Union. Food needed to not just fulfill calorific needs, but also provide joy. Enter Anastas Mikoyan, the man employed by Stalin to stoke the flames of passion about the nation's relationship with food. He was appointed as the people's commissar of the food industry and was tasked on figuring out how to feed a starving country and unite the whole Soviet bloc under one food culture. To Mikoyan, the solution was a no-brainer. From his view, the new cuisine should be cheap, convenient, high calories, pre-packaged and distributed to the masses. He went to America to learn about food production and consumption in the US. Not a surprise, but that US trip inspired the purchase of industrial equipment for the industrial production of sausages, ice cream, and he churned out 2 million hamburgers daily. For many, these foods were weird and foreign. Mikoyan saw that for people to embrace this food, they needed to become cultured Soviet citizens. And so, in 1939, the official Bible on how to eat Soviet food was born, the Book of Tasty and Healthy Food. By 1939, most of the nation was starving, traumatized by the horrors of forced collectivization, but still the government needed to propagate the notion of a prosperous and cultural population in some of the most privileged cities. Through the 400 pages and 1,400 recipes of the book, the government told the tale of the advantages of socialism. Mikoyan colluded with food scientists to create nutritional guidelines, advertisements for prepackaged food, and giving advice on how to store food and even table manners. But whilst all is well and good telling your population to use a refrigerator, it falls on deaf ears when your population is too poor to afford one. Canned goods and convenience foods were promoted so that the builders of communism could save their precious time and energy for work, play, and being freed from the kitchen. Despite this move towards convenience food, typical under the American capitalism that the Soviets were so keen to distance themselves from, the 1939 edition boasts that our flourishing motherland, pacing at the forefront of progressive mankind in the fight for peace and security for all people, is becoming more and more beautiful. Socialism liberated our people from the wolf's laws of capitalism, hunger, poverty, and chronic malnutrition, from the need to adapt their needs and tastes to the primitive choice of food. The book was characteristically optimistic, described as embodying an almost aggressive cheeriness, and by the 1950s it was a staple in people's home. By the 50s, Khrushchev's thaw was in effect, and it shows. With women previously to be liberated from the kitchen, the 1952 edition contains a whole section devoted to the kitchen chores of a Soviet woman, containing literature on kitchen appliance and utensils, food stock and organizing the kitchen, although many of these appliances, described in all their glory, was not actually available or was a luxury item reserved for the political elite. The cookbook sells a fantasy. It was more about showing people the abundance of food out there, rather than really helping people in preparing food. Some instructions were incredibly vague, like put meat in the oven until cooked, and not mentioning serving sizes or preparation times. It gives utopian recommendations for a 3-course meal with an appetizer, herring with a side dish, the first course, meat and cabbage soup, the second course, chopped meat and fried potatoes, the third course, kisel, which was completely unrealistic. Creating standards for food culture is part of the important narrative of the book, introducing a healthy diet and urban living standards. This with sections on the importance of a balanced diet for human development, dietetic therapy, and baby food. And laying the table becomes a section that expands with each edition, demonstrating the mythology of a prosperous and aesthetically pleasing way of life. Place the napkins folded as a triangle or a cap on a snack plate. If you have a dinner party, serve with a shot glass for vodka, a glass for wine, and 2 glasses for mineral water, and fruit and tomato juice next to each table place. Ingredients, which began as sophisticated, exotic, and overly bourgeoisie, were replaced by simple and obvious ones. A comparative analysis of the editions of 1939 and 1952 reveals that the latter lacked the recipes for complex dishes, with exclusive ingredients contained in the former: deep-fried fish, catfish with apples, and beef with oranges. You will also not find croutons, canapé, endives, or romaine lettuce in the 1952 edition. The reality was food scarcity was pervasive. Much of the population went to bed hungry, and those who did not manage to buy food that day had few options. Corruption meant that grocery store shelves went bare, with elites siphoning goods before it could reach the shelves. By the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, there was much hunger, anger, and resentment. But still, the recipe book holds a cultural legacy and is much loved in Russian culture, if as a cultural relic or a coffee table book. How fascinating for us all. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Please like, subscribe, and share. I really appreciate your support, and I will see you next time.